My wife got pregnant and tried to pass her affair child as mine. I found out and I divorced her. But here's what she didn't count on. I didn't say a single word to her for 9 days after I knew. 9 days of sitting across the dinner table, discussing nursery colors, asking how her appointments went, while I built a file that would eventually cost her the house she'd already started planning to take from me. She thought silence meant I was clueless. She was wrong. I found what started everything on a Tuesday night, looking for a takeout menu, a hospital bracelet, crumpled in the junk drawer that changed the entire shape of my marriage. It was a Wednesday when she'd gone to the ER 2 years before, a mild allergic reaction to something she'd eaten at a work event. I drove her, waited 3 hours, brought her home. The bracelet had been on her wrist when they discharged her, and she must have pulled it off in the car. Blood type printed in the standard font they use, AB positive. I remembered it because the nurse had mentioned it while reviewing her chart, and I'd thought absently that we were different. I'm O positive, which I'd known since a blood drive in college. I hadn't thought about it again until Dr. Simmons mentioned my blood type during a routine physical 3 weeks before I found the bracelet. It floated back to me the way useless details do, the kind of thing your brain stores without your permission. The prenatal summary from Diane's OB had been sitting on the kitchen counter for 4 days before I actually read it. She hadn't hidden it. She'd left it under a grocery receipt, and I'd moved it twice without opening it. When I finally did, I wasn't looking for anything. I was just reading. The summary listed routine information, and near the bottom, a notation about fetal blood indicators, consistent with type B. I set the paper down carefully, which is a strange thing to do when your hands want to do something else entirely. I know enough biology to understand the math. O positive and AB positive do not produce type B. I looked it up anyway, sitting at the kitchen island at 11:30 at night, because I am the kind of person who confirms things before he believes them. The results were the same across 4 different sources. I sat there for a while. I didn't eat the Thai food I'd been looking for the number to order. The bracelet was still in my hand. I folded it and put it in my jacket pocket instead of back in the drawer. Diane was asleep. I could hear the white noise machine she'd started using in the 2nd month of the pregnancy. I stood in the hallway outside our bedroom door for maybe 2 minutes, which felt like a strange amount of time to stand in a hallway. Then I went to my home office, sat down at my desk, and photographed the bracelet and the prenatal summary with my phone. I didn't sleep much. In the morning, I drove to work, parked in the structure, and called my brother Paul from the car. Paul is a contractor. He is not a dramatic person. When I told him about the blood types, he was quiet for long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, "Don't move any money. Don't say anything to her yet. Come over tonight." I said, okay. I spent the workday doing load calculations for a pedestrian bridge, which is either a very normal or a very strange thing to do after the night I'd had. I'm a structural engineer. Problems that have solutions are easier to sit with than problems that don't, so I stayed in the ones that had solutions until 5 o'clock. At Paul's that evening, we sat at his kitchen table with my phone between us and looked up prenatal paternity testing. Paul ate a sandwich that involved an amount of mustard that should concern anyone who cares about him. We learned that legal-grade postnatal testing was the cleaner route for admissibility purposes. Paul said he knew a family law attorney through a dispute with a former client, and that she was apparently very good at her job. He texted her that night. I drove home around 9. Diane was on the couch watching something, and she looked up when I came in and said she'd save me dinner. I said thanks. She asked if I was okay. I said long day on site. She accepted that, the way she always accepted that answer. And I thought about how many times I'd offered it and she'd filed it away without pressure because the simplest explanation had always been enough. I'd been attributing the distance in our marriage to work, mine mostly. Long project cycles, early mornings, weekends on site during complicated phases. Diane had framed it that way often enough, not cruelly, just observationally, and I'd accepted the framing because it was easier than looking for the other kind. She had pulled back emotionally somewhere around 18 months ago, and I'd told myself she was stressed about her mother's health and the shift from full-time marketing to freelance. I'd worked harder. I'd tried to be more present. I'd booked a weekend trip we never ended up taking because she said work was overwhelming. There'd been a weekend she took with college friends about 17 months ago, 3 days. She came back with her hair different and a sunburn on her shoulders and was warm toward me for about a week after. in that specific way of someone managing guilt or relief or both. I hadn't let myself think about why. I was thinking about it now. The next morning, Carol Reyes had a cancellation at 8. Paul had texted her the situation in whatever language you use to describe that situation in a text, and she'd fit me in. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown, and she had a credenza behind her desk, stacked with files and a plant that was thriving, which I found reassuring for no logical reason. She listened to everything without writing anything down until I finished, and then she wrote for about 45 seconds. She told me what I needed: bank statements going back 6 months minimum, any written communications that were relevant, and patience. She told me not to confront Diane. She explained in terms that were not unkind but were extremely clear what happened to men who confronted first and documented second. Then she asked whether there were any outstanding financial instruments, refinances, loans, new accounts, that I might not be aware of. I said no. I believed that when I said it. I left her office and went back to the bridge. That afternoon, I checked the mail on my way in from the garage. There was a letter from a mortgage company I had never contacted, thanking me for submitting my refinance application. I stood in the driveway reading it twice. Then I went inside, put the mail on the counter, said hello to Diane, who was on a call in her office, and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the letter for another minute. The next morning, I called the number on it from the parking lot of a gas station 2 miles from our house. A loan officer answered. I told her I was calling about an application submitted in my name. She said she couldn't share specific details over an unverified call, but confirmed an application was pending for the property at our address. I asked what documentation had been submitted. She said she could only speak with verified applicants and suggested I come in with identification. I took a photo of the letter. I texted Carol one sentence. We need to talk about a mortgage application I didn't file. She called back in 4 minutes. Her voice had a different quality than it had in the office the day before. Not alarmed, but focused in the way that means a problem has become a different kind of problem. She said to come in that afternoon and to bring the letter. She also said to photograph both sides of every piece of mail from any financial institution I received in the next 30 days. That night at dinner, Diane talked about whether we should paint the nursery a specific shade of green or wait until we knew the gender. I said either way worked for me. She passed me the bread. I passed her the salad. I was already changing my direct deposit on my phone under the table. The following 2 weeks were the strangest of my life, and I've spent time on active construction sites during thunderstorms, so that's not a small statement. Carol had advised me to maintain normal domestic behavior. Document ongoing participation, she said. Good faith. So, I came home at the same time, made coffee on weekends, asked about the pregnancy, and assembled a flat-pack bookshelf for the nursery one Saturday afternoon, while Diane sat in the doorway and talked about the pediatrician she was considering. I drove a screw into a wooden peg and said the name sounded good. I was also, in the hours between those moments, building a paper record that was becoming increasingly difficult to look at directly. Paul had copies of everything from the original home purchase, mortgage documents, deed, the appraisal from when we'd bought the place. He stored them in a locked filing cabinet in his home office next to a box of old tax returns and what appeared to be 17 years of accumulated warranty cards for appliances he no longer owned. He insisted on keeping the copies there rather than at my house, which was the right call, and he communicated this by saying, "Your house isn't your house right now," which was blunt in the way that Paul is blunt, meaning it landed harder than he probably intended, and he immediately offered me a bad sandwich to soften it. I pulled 6 months of joint bank statements. The transfers that showed up under household expenses didn't match anything I could find. Not the utilities, not the grocery patterns, not any contractor I recognized from the renovation we'd done on the kitchen 2 years prior. $14,000, distributed across 8 months in amounts between $800 and $2,000, all labeled the same way in the memo line. I put the statements in a folder. I put the folder in my work bag. I drove it to Paul's on a Tuesday evening and added it to the cabinet. Carol's forensic document examiner came back with a written assessment of the preliminary refinance application. The signature attributed to me on the application did not match my signature on file at our bank. This was documented in 4 pages of comparative analysis with side-by-side images that I found both clinical and nauseating to look at. The refinance hadn't gone through. The lender had paused the application pending additional documentation, which meant Diane had been waiting on a process that was already stalled, without knowing it had also attracted my attorney's attention. The timing of my response had mattered. A few more weeks, and that loan might have closed. I filed the assessment in the cabinet next to the bank statements. At home, Diane sensed something shifting, though I don't think she could have named what it was. She started bringing me coffee in my home office in the evenings. She'd stand in the doorway for a few minutes, ask about work, make a comment about something funny she'd heard on a podcast. I watched her do this and recognized it as warmth, genuine or performed, or some mixture I couldn't separate, and I let myself sit with the feeling of it for approximately 4 minutes each time before I put it somewhere else. One Thursday evening, she sat on the corner of my desk and said she knew things had felt distant, and she wanted that to change. She said she thought once the baby came, we'd find our way back to each other. She said she was sorry for how hard it had been. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, "I've been thinking we should go over the finances together before the baby comes. Make a plan." She went still in a way that was not dramatic, just sudden. "That's a great idea," she said. "We should do that soon." She never brought it up again. About a week after that, I found Theo Barrett. It wasn't complicated. The Venmo notification I'd photographed on Diane's phone was from TB for weekend. I searched Theo Barrett on LinkedIn because I knew the name vaguely as someone from her college, and a profile came up immediately. Graphic designer, mid-sized studio, a professional headshot that answered a question I hadn't asked out loud. I kept looking. A mutual connection on one of Diane's platforms had posted a group photo from an alumni weekend dinner 19 months ago. Diane was in it. Theo was seated next to her. The photo had been up for over a year and a half. I sat with my laptop at the kitchen table for about 30 seconds, then closed it and made dinner. My father called on a Friday to ask how Diane was feeling and to tell me he'd started putting money aside for a college fund because you never start too early. His voice was so straightforwardly happy that I had to put the phone down for a second and look out the window at the backyard. I told him Diane was doing well. I told him that was very generous. After we hung up, I sat in my car in the garage for a while before going inside. The people who love me were going to be hurt by information that wasn't their fault. That's the part no one tells you about, the collateral weight of it. Diane's mother, Renata, called the following Tuesday. She said Diane had mentioned I'd been distant and strange during the pregnancy and that this was the most important time to be present for my wife. She said she'd raised Diane to need a partner who shows up. She didn't say this unkindly exactly, but she said it with the confidence of someone who believed she had the complete picture. I was polite. I noted the date and time in a log I'd started keeping on my phone. I didn't mention the mortgage or the blood type. After I hung up, I thought about Renata for a few minutes. Whether she knew anything, whether she suspected anything, whether she was a participant, or simply someone who loved her daughter and had been handed a curated version of events. I decided I didn't know and couldn't assume. The mortgage company called on a Thursday morning while Diane was home. She took the call in her office with the door closed, which was not unusual. She worked from home. But she came out afterward and found me in the kitchen and told me the mortgage company had called about the application we started. She used those words, the application we started. She said she'd initiated it for the family's financial security. She said she was going to tell me about it. She said she hadn't wanted to worry me during a busy project phase. I said, "What application?" She said I'd mentioned wanting to access the equity, which I had not. Then she said she thought we'd discussed it briefly and she'd move forward assuming we were on the same page, which was a different explanation than the previous one. Then she said she'd done it because she was scared about money and hadn't wanted to burden me with the details, which was a third explanation that arrived within about 4 minutes of the first. I said, "I'd like to see the paperwork." She said she'd look for it. She never produced it. That Friday, Carol called in the afternoon. She said Diane had retained her own attorney. There was a preservation letter, a formal notice that divorce proceedings were being considered, designed to protect assets and establish positioning. Diane had likely been planning this longer than the letter implied, Carol said, and the pregnancy combined with residency established in the home created leverage that we needed to address directly. She said, "She may file first. We need to move." I sat in my car in the work parking structure and listened to traffic on the level above me. The situation had a specific shape now. Diane had legal counsel, a pregnancy, the house, and a social narrative she'd been building for months. I had documents in Paul's filing cabinet and a forensic signature report that no one outside that cabinet had seen yet. Carol told me the most important remaining piece was the paternity question and how it entered the legal record. She walked me through what declining to sign the birth certificate meant procedurally and what a legal-grade postnatal test required. She was clear that I shouldn't move on anything emotionally before I understood what I was moving toward practically. I said I understood. That evening I came home, and Diane was making pasta and asked how my day was, and I said fine, and she said the OB appointment Thursday had gone well, everything looked healthy. I said that was good. She looked at me a little longer than usual. I looked back steadily. She turned back to the stove. My phone buzzed on the counter. Unknown number. I picked it up. The text said, "Hey, Diane said you two worked everything out and want to figure out the co-parenting arrangement. I'm Theo. Can we set up a call?" I read it once. I read it again. I set my phone face down on the counter and finished setting the table. Then I went to the bathroom, closed the door, and took a screenshot. I forwarded it to Carol with a message that said, "She told him I already agreed." Carol responded 11 minutes later. "Don't reply, don't delete. I'll call you tomorrow morning." I went back to the kitchen. Diane asked if everything was okay. I said someone from work had texted about a project detail. She nodded and served the pasta. We ate dinner. I asked if she wanted more water. She said yes. I refilled her glass. She had told Theo I knew. She had told Theo we'd worked it out. She had built 2 separate stories for 2 separate people and believed both would hold indefinitely. And now those 2 stories had made direct contact through a text to my phone, and she was sitting across from me talking about whether the pasta needed more salt, with no idea that the architecture she'd built had just developed a structural failure that no amount of narrative management was going to fix. I thought, I know what that looks like. I fix those for a living. The courthouse had fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell, and the chairs in the corridor were the kind that seemed specifically designed to prevent comfort. I sat in one of them with Carol beside me and a paper coffee cup I'd stopped actually drinking from about 20 minutes earlier. Down the hall, Diane was with her attorney, a man in a dark suit who had the practiced calm of someone billing by the hour. She looked at me once when they came out of the elevator. I looked back. Then I checked my phone. The preliminary hearing was about temporary asset arrangements, specifically the house. Diane's attorney opened by establishing the pregnancy, the marriage duration, the domestic situation, and Diane's position as primary caregiver for a child not yet born. He was composed and methodical and made a reasonable-sounding argument for temporary exclusive occupancy of the marital home. The language was careful. The framing was of a pregnant woman in a stable domestic environment that should not be disrupted during an emotionally difficult period. Carol let him finish. Then she entered the forensic signature analysis into the record. 4 pages, documented comparison, professional certification. The signature attributed to my name on the preliminary refinance application did not match my authenticated signature. A cash-out refinance had been initiated against a jointly owned property using a signature that was not mine, without my knowledge. Diane's attorney looked at the document and asked for a moment to review. Carol entered the bank statements next. $14,000 in transfers from the joint account over 8 months, attributed to household expenses, unmatched by any corresponding household expenditure in the documented financial record. Then she entered Theo's text. She read it into the record without commentary, the sender identifying himself, the statement that Diane had told him we'd worked everything out, the request to arrange co-parenting logistics. She noted that this communication established that Diane had represented to the biological father that her husband had full knowledge of and consent to an arrangement he had in fact never agreed to, discussed, or been informed of. She then entered the result of the legal-grade paternity test. Postnatal, certified chain of custody, court admissible. I was not the biological father of the child. The room had the quality of a place where the temperature hasn't changed, but something else has. Diane's attorney requested a recess. The judge, a woman in her mid-50s who had the expression of someone who had heard many things in this room and was nonetheless paying close attention, said they'd take 15 minutes. I went to the corridor and stood next to a window that looked out onto a parking structure. Carol came and stood beside me and said, "You're doing fine," which was the most personal thing she'd said to me in 2 months of working together. I appreciated it more than I expected to. When we went back in, Diane's attorney had pivoted. He acknowledged the paternity question and argued that regardless of biological parentage, the marriage had been of significant duration. The assets were jointly held, and division should proceed accordingly. This was partially true, and Carol acknowledged it. The divorce would involve asset division, and that division would account for contributions from both parties. What it would also account for, Carol noted, was the fraudulent refinance application, which she had referred to the lender's compliance office, creating a formal record of bad faith financial conduct during the marriage. The compliance referral didn't require a criminal proceeding to affect the civil case. It created a documented pattern that bore directly on asset management and the question of which party had acted in good faith. The judge issued a temporary restraining order on the property. Neither party could encumber it, refinance it, sell it, or transfer interest in it until proceedings concluded. Diane would not have exclusive occupancy. The jointly owned home would remain jointly held, legally frozen, until the full divorce process determined the appropriate resolution. Diane's attorney said something to her quietly. She did not look at me. She was looking at a point somewhere past Carol's left shoulder, with the expression of someone recalculating a set of numbers that have stopped adding up the way they were supposed to. Outside the courthouse afterward, I was walking to my car when I heard Renata's voice behind me. She'd been there, which I hadn't known. I stopped and turned around. She looked tired in a way that seemed recent. She said Diane had told her I already knew about Theo, that it was complicated, but we discussed everything, and I was adjusting. She said she'd called me to push me to be more present because that was the story she'd been given. She paused for a moment and said, "She told me you'd agreed. I wouldn't have pushed you the way I did if I'd known." I said, "I know, I meant it." Renata had been handed a version of events and had acted on it, which is a different thing from knowing the truth and choosing to go along anyway. I didn't ask anything else from her. She nodded once and walked back toward the entrance. I don't know exactly what she said to Diane after that, and I decided that wasn't mine to need to know. Jamie texted that week, one of our mutual friends, part of a couple Diane and I had socialized with for years. The text said they didn't know what to believe and were going to stay out of it. I replied, that was fair. I meant that too. I'd expected nothing and received exactly that, which felt cleaner than either full support or open antagonism. The divorce proceedings ran another 4 months. Financial discovery moved slowly and then all at once, the way those things do. Because the home had been primarily funded by my income, documented through payment records going back to the purchase, and because the attempted refinance constituted bad faith financial conduct, the settlement awarded me the house with a buyout provision to Diane reflecting her actual documented equity contribution, which was considerably less than the 50% she'd initially sought. The $14,000 in transfers was treated as a marital debt offset against her share. The signature fraud referral stayed with the lender's compliance office. Carol told me it might result in further action, or it might not, that it was documented either way, and that it was now out of both our hands. She didn't make it sound like more than it was. I appreciated that. Theo, having received accurate information at some point in the process, did not contest paternity. He and Diane began making their own arrangements. I don't know the details of what that looked like, and I made a deliberate decision not to try to find out. My name did not appear on the birth certificate. I had no legal or financial obligation to the child. The child had not done anything to me, and I wanted to be clear with myself about that distinction, which took some work to hold on to in the early weeks, but got easier. About 3 weeks before the divorce was finalized, Diane asked through her attorney if I'd be willing to meet informally. I said yes, with the condition that it be in a public place and limited to 30 minutes. We met at a cafe near her mother's neighborhood, where she'd been staying. She said she'd made a terrible mistake. She said she'd panicked after the pregnancy and hadn't been able to see a way through that didn't involve what she'd done. She said she did love me, in her way. She said she wondered sometimes if they could have managed it differently. I looked at her face across the table and recognized the grammar of what she was doing, the invitation to decide together whether her choices had really been both our problems to own. I'd heard smaller versions of this conversation throughout the marriage, about smaller things, and I'd always found a way to accept partial responsibility for something I hadn't done because it was easier than sitting with the alternative. I said, "No, I couldn't have managed it differently. You could have." I left after 22 minutes. I made it to the car before anything happened, and what happened was brief, and I found it embarrassing in a way that said something accurate about me. I drove home with the radio on. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in November. Carol called me from the courthouse because I hadn't needed to be present for the final filing. She said it was done. I said thank you. She said I was welcome and that I should call if anything came up. And I said I would, and I think we both understood I wouldn't need to. That evening I changed the locks. It was a practical action. Diane had moved her remaining belongings out 2 weeks prior, and the house was mine now in the way that required rekeying, not in the way that required explanation. I did it myself because I know how and because Paul had offered to come help and I'd told him I had it. And he'd said, "Okay, call me after," and then texted 30 minutes later to say he'd made sandwiches and I could come over whenever. I texted back, "They're always bad." He texted, "I know, come anyway." I finished the locks. I sat on the front step for a few minutes in the November air, which was cold enough to be clarifying. The neighborhood was quiet. The house behind me was mine, paid for with 6 years of direct deposits and documented payment history, and one forensic signature comparison that had cost me $800 and saved me considerably more than that. My father had come over 2 Saturdays before to help me with some repairs I'd been putting off. He didn't say the right things when I told him the full picture. He said some of the wrong things first, the way people do when they don't have a script for information this size. But he showed up the following weekend with his tools and helped me patch drywall where Diane's shelf brackets had been installed badly, which was something he knew how to fix, so that's what he fixed. We didn't talk about the divorce while we worked. We talked about the bridge project I was finishing and whether he should replace his truck, and that was exactly the right conversation to be having. The nursery furniture was still in the spare room in boxes. I hadn't opened them. I'd bought them before I knew anything, in the weeks after she told me about the pregnancy, when I was still the person who drove to 3 different stores to find the right crib and didn't mind spending a Saturday on it. I put the boxes in storage without opening them, not because I was performing something, just because I didn't know yet what to do with the version of myself who had bought them, and storage felt honest about that uncertainty. Renata texted me once in December, asked if I was doing okay. I replied, "Getting there." She didn't push further. I didn't reach out again. I was cleaning out the junk drawer in January finally, because it had been bothering me since October, and I'd been putting it off in the way you put off things that have too much attached to them. Takeout menus, dead batteries, an Allen wrench for the furniture we no longer had, rubber bands, 2 expired pharmacy loyalty cards. At the back, behind a flashlight that needed new batteries, I found the hospital bracelet. I held it for a moment. It was a thin strip of white plastic with Diane's name and the date of her ER visit and her blood type in standard print. AB positive. It weighed almost nothing. I thought about how much information that small object had been quietly carrying in a kitchen drawer for 2 years, without anyone knowing it mattered. I put it in a box going to storage. Not the trash. I wasn't making a statement about it. I just didn't need it in the drawer anymore. I closed the drawer. I started the coffee maker. I had a site inspection Thursday. The bridge was coming along.